Welcome to the Psychedelia Podcast, where we talk about the third wave of psychedelics. Through our many wide-ranging conversations with scientists, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and event organizers, we bring you an exclusive look into the many minds of the psychedelic world. It's time to let the word out about psychedelics and how they can be used as tools to benefit both the individual and the community. Welcome to the third wave.
Yo, welcome back to the Psychedelia Podcast. I'm recording this intro from Amsterdam. I'm out in a beautiful garden. I have like a co-working space. It's called Regis. You can get them all over the world. And the one here in Amsterdam is on a canal, like an old canal house with this beautiful garden in the back. So I'm here. It's sunny. It's gorgeous. I really like the Netherlands, and it's a pleasure to be here. About a week ago, I interviewed Daniel Pinchbeck, who is a pretty well-known author, has written Breaking Open the Head, which was published in the early 2000s, which is probably his best-known book, but recently published this book, How Soon Is Now, which is about how the global ecological crisis could precipitate a massive initiation/awakening for consciousness to really get people actively involved in community and becoming more aware about their surroundings and their situation. And I wanted to interview Daniel about this book. And so he joined us this week for a discussion on psychedelics and the current global crisis. You know, this book also lays out the failings of our modern culture and examines how indigenous traditions could help put things back on track. So in this podcast, you'll hear a little bit about Daniel's own psychedelic past, and you'll also hear some practical advice on how we can change things both within the psychedelic community, but also on a more global level for the better. I met Daniel at Beyond Psychedelics in Prague about 6 or 7 months ago, and he is definitely one of the sharper minds in the psychedelic space. And I think you'll really, really enjoy his insights into, psychedelia, into the current political climate, into various other things that are written about in his books. And I hope that you guys enjoy the show. A couple announcements. We are starting to roll out psychedelic consulting and coaching. So if you want to use psychedelics, if you're unsure the best way to use them, if you want to integrate them into your life for personal benefit, for whatever that might be, we're rolling that out. We're starting to roll that out where I will do coaching with a small amount of clients who are interested in basically utilizing psychedelics for personal growth and benefit. Second announcement, we are going to keep looking for reviews. So if you could take a couple minutes after this podcast, or even right now, if you're on your phone, and just take 2 minutes, leave a review, let people know what you think. We have, I think, 11 or 12 now reviews on iTunes, and the more the better. The more reviews we have, the better we do, I think, in like iTunes algorithms, and the more people download our show, the more this message is heard. So if you could just take a couple minutes and do that, we would really appreciate it. So without further ado, enjoy this podcast with Daniel Pinchbeck. Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. We have a cool little interview for you today. I'm interviewing Daniel Pinchbeck here in Amsterdam. Daniel's in town for an ayahuasca workshop? Or?
No, actually, it was a conference at the Stedelijk Museum for the Rietveld Academy on, it was called What's Happening to Our Brains. And one of the tracks was on sort of psychedelics and altered states. And so I gave a talk around ayahuasca.
And what did you discuss in that talk? What was the kind of purpose of that talk?
Good question. I use it sort of to introduce concepts around ayahuasca and the visionary experience, and the question of, are hallucinations simply brain-based, or are they somehow connected to some other order of reality, like an implicit order or something? And kind of also an idea that really intrigues me about the question of what's, this guy Tom Roberts wrote a book called The Psychedelic Future of the Mind, and he looked at psychedelics as like a second Reformation, and that the first Reformation was Martin Luther translating the Bible into the common languages. And now we have, with psychedelics, people can have the direct revelation. They'll just read about it in the books. Before the Reformation, people were beholden to the priests who held the knowledge, and they were able to read the knowledge for themselves. Now they can have the direct experience for themselves. Is that like a second, does that point towards a whole, kind of ultimate transformation of our religious models, institutions, and so on? I love that idea. I mean, I felt like, the art context. I used to write about contemporary art a lot, and it's very problematic. There were two speakers at the end of the day who were really speaking from an art critical perspective. One of them was talking about these West Coast artists like Mike Kelly and Jim Shaw, who were definitely influenced by psychedelics, but sort of took a pessimistic view, kind of almost like mocking the utopian and millenarian, like mystical hopes that one often finds through psychedelics. Then the other one was really almost like just trying to reduce psychedelia or psychedelic art to a kind of category in a way to make it another type of mediated expression. And I was like, no, like we had a discussion afterwards. I was like, look, the whole point, it's not about who cares about psychedelic art. The point is that when you have the experience, you're like you have to have this phenomenological opening, and you can think about yourself and the world differently. And I don't know, it just feels with academic discourse, there's always this incredible desire to like enclose and control a subject. So particularly this type of subject, almost dismissively. So anyway, it was interesting for me because that was part of my background, was writing about art and thinking about art a lot. Then I kind of rejected it because I felt that the art world, in a way, is just like, another container that allows for like visionary ideas or potentially revolutionary ideas to be kind of assimilated, subsumed within the capitalist kind of regime of like knowledge and information or something.
Interesting. Let's go back to the point that you just made about academia and how it can be somewhat restrictive. How does that play out specific to the psychedelic space, where we've seen a lot of the progress over the last 10 years, a lot of the narrative has been driven by academic institutions as the resurgence of psychedelic research from Johns Hopkins and whatnot?
Yeah, that's a different thing I'm talking about. Yeah, I mean, that's been amazing. When my first book, Breaking Open the Head, was on psychedelic shamanism. The subtitle was Psychedelic Journey into the Heart of Contemporary Shamanism. And at that point, for 30 years, academic research had disallowed the psychedelics had been disallowed from the academies, basically, since the 60s. And the mainstream psychedelics could only be treated with, like, dismissal and ridicule and repression. And yeah, that's changing now. But in a weird way, you would think the art world would be a progressive world, but actually in some ways it's very regressive. It's like it hasn't even caught up yet. They're holding on to these types of constructs in some strange way that allow for this perpetuation of this course, this endless jamboree of like art events and just documentas and biennials around the world and so on, which to me it's like very problematic, because I wrote about this in a way in Breaking Open the Head. We're faced with an ecological crisis, and our excessive specializations of intellectual discourses and so on is somehow designed to prevent people from getting a whole picture of where we are as a species. So when I listen to certain people who are in the art world shape their discourses, I feel it's really more about perpetuating certain types of kind of, you could say, like knowledge power complexes or something. Culture capital, creating culture capital for those who are like within an in-group, like an insular group, rather than trying to wrestle maybe with like the more authentic questions of our moment, which is really like, how are we going to keep going as a species when we're this disconnected, from what's happening to the planet. And so, so on the exciting side of the medical and the scientific, the psychiatric side, since my first book came out in 2002, there's now this explosion of research around the world and realization that these substances may have credible clues for us, both in the workings of the human brain and beyond.
Well, and I was expecting to have more of that insight in the recent book that you wrote, How Soon Is Now, that was published about a month ago. And I was surprised to see that the emphasis wasn't so much on psychedelics, but more generally looking at various aspects of like initiation and community consciousness. What role do you think psychedelics will play specifically in helping us to solve or fix or heal, this ecological crisis that we're dealing with?
I mean, as a writer and a thinker who's outside of academics and establishment institutions, there's some amazing things about being in that position. And for me, I don't like to repeat myself. So I felt that I'd already spoken a lot about the psychedelic experience, and to write about it again would have mainly seemed like repeating things that I already said. And I felt there were other issues. And I also wanted to, in a sense, How Soon Is Now is totally informed by, my psychedelic experiences, which I see not only as personal, but also as, having a political and a social dimension. So I was trying to sort of it's been a many-year process trying to tease out the political and social implications of the psychedelic experience. And so that's, in a way, what I was trying to do in that book, rather than talk specifically about, the subcategory of psychedelics, although it's in there. What was the larger question you asked, though?
So specifically then for psychedelics, you talk about this in the book.
What's the value?
Yeah.
Well, I actually think that psychedelics are, including MDMA, are going to become overtly necessary to human survival in the next decades. And that's what we're seeing now is like a preliminary wave of kind of like foreshadowing of that understanding, because when we look at what's happening ecologically, we're definitely going to see a lot of collective trauma. And we're going to see a lot of people thrown from the past that they thought they were going to be on. It's also happening through automation and changings in work culture and so on. And without something like psychedelics, it's very hard for people to readapt, to change, to open to new experience, to change their perspective. So I think, like, in a way, we need something that can clear the psyche, clear the ego, of old programming. And we're seeing, for instance, with the studies that the phase 3 clinical trials they're doing on MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, that's having like a 60% cure rate on treatment-averse forms of PTSD in veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Well, what does that tell us? What can we do with Syrian refugees or refugees from, who are going to be fleeing like droughts and natural disasters, who are going to be traumatized? Maybe MDMA-assisted therapy in kind of clinics in refugee situations is going to be a way to help people snap out of the weight of the past and just be connected to, the moment. It could be similar with ayahuasca. We're learning about use of these substances for depression. I mean, the studies with psilocybin on Johns Hopkins, giving them to people who never had a psychedelic experience before and finding that they had long-term positive benefits for their psychological health and a permanent openness to new experience. Well, we can see how fast our civilization is changing as the ecological crisis unfolds and technology accelerates. I mean, openness to new experience is definitely something that we're going to want people to have.
Great. And I'll let you take a sip of your cappuccino because I know that's getting cold. And I think, that the point you bring up is also, I was doing some research for this the other day in terms of what are the implications of when, for example, psilocybin and MDMA become medicalized in 2021, I think is what they're saying, supposedly, the fast track. We have 24 million people in the United States right now who have PTSD. We have 15 million people who have treatment-resistant depression. While there might be some overlap, that's generally about 35 to 40 million people who could find some level of healing from these substances. What are those implications from a backdoor perspective in legitimizing psychedelics at a more mainstream level to make them not only accessible for people as medicine, but also as, for example, tools to explore consciousness or as something that we just have the freedom to use as a way to explore our own consciousness?
Yeah, and I think it'll all go together probably, and that's probably one reason there'll be a lot of social resistance to it. I'm already seeing that with marijuana. I mean, medical marijuana was the entry point for legitimizing recreational use. So we'll see what happens. And obviously, at the moment there's a kind of regressive counterculture happening in the U.S. and globally. If that can be kind of overcome and beaten back, then I think the potential for an acceleration of progress in these areas is there.
Now, in your book, I want to get back to this book because I do want to focus more and more of our chat on that. How soon is now? Could you just give like a brief, maybe 5 to 10 minute kind of scope for our listeners about what questions were you trying to answer with that book? And what did you discover in writing it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, How Soon Is Now is in a strange way a completion of a trilogy that started with Breaking Open the Head. And each book has been, the genesis of it was a series of questions or deep questions that I felt I couldn't find an answer for in the culture. Then finally, I realized that since I couldn't find that answer, I had to try to provide it for myself. The questions of the first book was kind of like this visionary experience through plant sacraments and chemicals that you can have. It was considered so sacred to all the traditional cultures around the world. Why is it demonized and repressed in our culture? What's the meaning of it that's so dangerous for our world, in that sense, or for our worldview? And then the second book was having established the validity of shamanic practices and even the reality of these types of psychic experiences that people like Carl Jung talk about and all the indigenous cultures talk about. I was then asking myself, well, okay, like if this indigenous and traditional knowledge has access to levels of information that are far beyond what our culture understands, then what does it mean that we've suppressed and ignored what they have to say about our world when all around the world these indigenous cultures are screaming out at us, that this is a prophetic time of transformation, that there's possible for catastrophe or shift into another world cycle, or both. What do all these things mean? It set me on a 5-year quest for knowledge, looking at cultures like the Hopi in Arizona and the Maya, the Aztecs, and also looking at, the Judeo-Christian tradition of the apocalypse and, Hindu traditions, Vedanta, and so on, and trying to sort of assimilate all of that and understand kind of deeper dynamics of system change that were happening. That led to my second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. That came out 10 years ago. And then when that book came out, I was like, okay, like I've sort of done my best to, kind of validate and understand all this stuff philosophically, theoretically, metaphysically. What would it actually mean? Like the Hopi talk about transition from a fourth world to a fifth world, or the Maya and Aztecs talk about age of the fifth sun and age of the sixth sun. In the New Age sort of spirituality world, they talk about a dimensional shift or a new frequency of consciousness or, whatever, or shift to the heart chakra. What does that actually mean in terms of our systems? Like we can see that, we're in an ecological crisis that's rapidly getting worse, that we're not somehow able to address from our current level of society and current level of consciousness. So what would it mean to address that? What would it take? Because that's really what led me to do this new book, which took me a really long time. So I had to study and assimilate so many different types of knowledge that I just didn't know about, whether it was thinking about, agriculture, energy and industry systems, or political and economic systems. I really believe in being able to speak clearly. There's a lot of theory out there. Like at this conference this weekend, people were talking about delusions and the body without organs, and it all gets you all excited or whatever, but it's like, it takes so much effort to kind of parse. And, then sometimes when you dig in, you're like, well, was that really worth like the 3 months I just spent to understand like these weird concepts or whatever? My thing is to try to convey, complex ideas in clear and comprehensible prose so that people, and I think anything that's really profound actually ultimately should be quite simple to understand. So we should be able to understand why this current system of government, is not going to be something that will create a sustainable or regenerative society. Why will our monetary system not allow us to live in a harmonic way on the planet? And then what do we do about these things? What types of literal just changes do we have to make or redesign do we have to make to our industrial systems, our energy systems and our farming systems? And I guess now I'm feeling a little bit like, it's still a good fight, but I feel like I did everything I could, not only to make the book comprehensible, but to package it in such a way that the mainstream could access and assimilate it. Like I had famous public artists, Russell Brand and Sting, kind of write introductions. I really played all my cards because they were into my work, and I kind of pulled those introductions out of them because, I really wanted the mainstream to be able to take seriously these ideas. And I don't feel it's really been effective at this point. Like I haven't gotten any reviews in like the newspapers in England or the New York Times. Like even The Guardian told one journalist that the book was too far out for them. And that was just really really depressing to me because it took me 10 years and I put so much into it, and I, could have easily made a much easier life for myself on many levels if I had chosen a different path. And I'm still kind of in recovery from that right now. Not that it's over. The book's only been out for a month or whatever, but there's a way that if you get certain types of attention in the mainstream, that leads to television. Like in the US, all of these right-wing assholes get tons of TV time talking about how they're cynical, shitty ideas about how the world is just going to get worse and worse. And, but if you try to spend years and years thinking about how the world can get so much better, even with the problems that we're facing, you can't get the attention of the mainstream. It really sucks.
And I want to say that I really enjoyed your book, and a lot of people that I've spoken to have read it have really enjoyed it. And obviously that's why I'm doing this interview with you, because I did find it to be a profoundly moving book.
Oh, cool.
And a very interesting book. And I think you wrote the book that I wanted to read, and you wrote the book that I think a lot of people need to read about these questions and about system changes and about what's going on. I think there's a level of denial in our society about the changes that are occurring. I even see this somewhat in the psychedelic space, where I think a lot of the mainstream narrative is driven by researchers and scientists who maybe are unwilling to accept that now is the time to also have a cultural push towards, asking questions like, how do we make these substances available for people who want to use them? How do we start? Because science is great, but naturally, I think as a culture, or as humans, we're very irrational. And so you need something that also, like you're saying, it puts science within a larger framework so that it's accessible for people. And I think, the book that you wrote did a tremendous job. And, my hope is that it will continue to grow and seem. And I think maybe it's just with all this Trump shit that's been going on, it's been a bit of a hectic kind of thing, So,
for me, it was highly synchronistic that, after working on it for 10 years and finally figuring it out, the book came out just exactly a month after his inauguration. And it's quite possible that he's going to bring about the systemic crisis that is necessary to, break apart these old structures and allow for something, quite different to come into play. And certainly in the US and maybe everywhere, it looks like ultimately we're either going to have a lot more democracy, more like a, truly participatory democratic system, or we'll have like no democracy. We'll have like fake voting booths and authoritarianism in the short term, and then ecological collapse in the medium term.
And so what do you think? Because you wrote a post on Facebook about this maybe like a month ago or so. I was on Facebook and I came across it basically detailing, this thought of yours on how the Trump administration could lead to this systemic collapse, which in place of it would allow a lot of the systems of what you're speaking about to flourish.
If there's an opportunity for the media to shift focus, because the media, as I talk about in the book, really like produces mass subjectivity. Yeah. So as long as, the only frequency out there is like fear and, conformity and so on, then like I think it's going to be very difficult. But we saw like 2008, there was a big financial meltdown, and that was due to the deregulation that, Bush and Clinton had supported and so on. So these guys just want to take all the, wheels, they want all the brakes off of the wheels of this capitalist system, and maximize short-term profit. And that's leading to all, the Wall Street people now are like, the market has shot up temporarily. But, there doesn't seem to me any doubt that will lead to another massive crash of the system, which I think is great. It has to crash. We have to reduce the amount of CO2 that we're emitting radically. And when the 2008 crash happened, we did. The CO2 went down also. Hard for people, of course, but ultimately, that's the theme of the book, that, we're going to need to go through some type of rite of passage together as a species to reckon with the impact of our industrial civilization and change our direction as a species, away from such an extractive and exploitative way of being.
When you were writing the book, what are, 2 or 3 really interesting things that you discovered that maybe you hadn't known before you started researching and writing?
It's hard to say. So many things, really. I got really fascinated by the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, her book On Revolution, where she discovered that in all these past epochs of revolution, as soon as the centralized structure of control breaks down, the people manifest an incredibly organic political nature where they start to self-organize. You saw this in Argentina when the money system collapsed. The workers took over the factories and ran them cooperatively, and people came together to in the local participatory, meetups to figure out what to do with their communities and collect garbage, all that stuff. So in a way, like these top-down control systems are suppressing our natural impetus to be politically, kind of fired up, collectively self-organizing beings, which is what, tribal societies around the world express. Another piece of that puzzle was the work of a anthropologist who lived with Amazonian tribes for many years, Pierre Klaus, wrote a book called Society Against the State. And he argued that in these tribal societies, there wasn't really any kind of hierarchical power. Nobody could, command anybody else to do anything. Even the chief, their role was actually a mediator and a storyteller and kind of like a holder of knowledge. But if they tried to order anybody to fight or whatever, they would just be laughed at. So that's another way that power can be organized in a society. But our mass society, going back to our Christian roots, chose like a path of indoctrination over initiation. So you use the same types of tools that people use in initiation, sort of getting people into an altered state of consciousness or a subconscious state and then programming their psyche. But they used it to dominate and control their behavior patterns, which is what we see at like a mass level in our society. So that even something like, violent video games, we all just accept, kids, and of course we're going to keep playing these shoot up games, but we don't recognize that that's actually normalizing violence, habituating people to be like, of course we're in a violent society where wars are fought all over the world. We're subliminally programming our children to accept a regime based on violence and domination and so on. And we're doing that on so many different levels. And that's how indoctrination becomes this kind of invisible programming mechanism of the society.
Fascinating. And so was there anything else that you discovered, anything else that you found to be interesting in the book outside of those 2 things?
The whole book is full of the things that I found to be really interesting.
That's a good one. Anything else that stands out for like a psychedelic specific audience?
Well, as I said, I think that the whole, the book is meant for a general mainstream audience, but it's also, meant for a psychedelic specific audience. Mm-hmm. In that perspective of the book was, I think when you have a psychedelic experience, particularly your first ones, there's a kind of phenomenological unpeeling, and suddenly you're like, what is this? Like, what am I in? It's like all surrounded by these like metal boxes, and there's hardly a tree around, and the tree is like the only thing that looks like that has reason, and we're using rectangular pieces of dirty paper that the society believes are of great value, whereas we treat people like shit, and there are people like sleeping in the sidewalk and vomiting in the gutter and so on, and our whole system of values is ridiculous, so that way that informs kind of how the frame in which we see the world. But yeah, like the question of the monetary system, like what's wrong with having only a debt-based currency that accrues interest, that forces artificial scarcity, creates winners and losers, leads some people to be bankrupt and others to be billionaires. Is that the best way we can create a system of value exchange? Oh, I guess another set of ideas that two of the main themes of the book. One is that we can look at, the ecological crisis as a rite of passage for humanity. And the other one is that as a result of this rite of passage, if we're going to maintain human society and close to its current form, we're ultimately going to realize that humanity as a whole is sort of like a planetary organism, like a superorganism. It's in a symbiotic
like a Gaia, kind of the Gaia.
Yeah, we're a giant superorganism, like a layer of bacteria or something that's in a symbiotic or relationship with the Earth's ecology as a whole system. In a sense, you could say we're like at the moment we're like a virus that's poisoning the host, but we could, because we have the capacity to think about, have foresight, and redirect ourselves, we could, in a sense, become the Gaian immune system, in a sense, and reprogram, repattern ourselves. Just as the same way in an organism like a body, you don't find a few cells hoarding all of the resources and depriving energy of the other cells, because that doesn't make any sense. We would have to think about ourselves, our cellular body of humanity in the same way, and figure out how we exchange resources, share resources, so that they're not like clotted up in these particular areas.
So, a lot of what you've spoken about from my perspective has been, idea-based. What are the practicalities of implementing a system like this that you talk about and how soon is now? I know you kind of dedicated, I think, either the epilogue or the last chapter in your book to, or these are the steps that people can actually take. What are the steps that individuals can take? What are the steps that you think communities can take to take this next step or help to evolve into this, next?
I do think it's very important that people have a comprehensive model, because otherwise, and that's, I feel like, one reason the kind of utopian left hasn't been very successful. There isn't a lot of coherence in the field about what, the alternative is or looks like. So that's why I feel books like my book are very helpful and important. I think Buckminster Fuller's books, Utopia or Oblivion and Operation Spaceship Earth, are really powerful. Jeremy Rifkin is an American writer, wrote a book called the Third Industrial Revolution, talking about how we could use automation to help people escape drudgery and so on. Paul Mason wrote a book called Post-Capitalism, also looking sort of at similar ideas. So I think people have to have a framework for understanding the types of changes that would bring us into a better situation. And then on the individual level, it's complicated. As I said, everyone's in a different place and everyone has different talents and skills and so on. But I think, first of all, having a genuine, there needs to be a general realization of how things have to change. And then there's the dynamics of system change are complicated. Like something like the Berlin Wall wasn't predicted, but when it happened, unfortunately, the only ideas that were available to people at that time were kind of like neoliberal economics, like privatize state resources and create oligarchies and so on. So if we can think that, global capitalism is inevitably going to hit relatively soon another major crisis point, which is almost guaranteed from the combination of what's happening ecologically, constraints on resources, peak oil, which nobody talks about again, then what are the ideas that we're going to replace it with? People have to have a general cognizance that there are other ideas and what they are. And then in that interim time that we're now in, we can begin to build prototypes and models and alternatives. So communities, alternative communities that are becoming more regenerative, more self-sufficient, looking at all the types of relations and practices that we would need to have, whether it's, could be urban communities with many different types of communities that mesh together. But, more people, learning how to grow their own food, or systems and structures that make that easy, like networks for, permaculture, platforms, or alternative currencies. Cryptocurrencies are already quite interesting. Mm-hmm. People can learn about like what's possible with a blockchain, how to create. Bitcoin is already quite interesting, but it doesn't really lead to a shift in values. It doesn't have any alternative kind of behavior patterns inscribed in it. But there are other, like a friend of mine created a platform called Time Republic, which is a timeshare system. So instead of exchanging dollars, you exchange hours. That's a very simple way for people to begin to shift from the money system. Other people I know created a social platform called Lumio, Loomio, which is a kind of way for communities to come together virtually to make decisions together based on the same principles that the Occupy movement used. So, anybody could community together online of their friends or people they know or, the psychedelic society or whatever it is. And then people can make proposals and make decisions together, without, what happened with Occupy is that it became very cumbersome for these people to all be together, and like crazy people would block the ability of people to make decisions. So have a virtual, kind of environment where people can debate and make decisions.
Like a model by consensus almost?
Exactly, yeah. So there's also there's reduction in resource use, but it's I can understand how people feel that's a little senseless in a global system where, it's like turbocharged towards excess resource use. I mean, I've really been interested in this idea that ultimately, we could use the internet. I don't know, platforms like, I don't know if they're popular here, like, well, obviously Kickstarter or Avaz, or there are all these ways people either sign petitions together or raise capital together. What about a platform where people agree on collective social contracts? Like, like if 1 million people all agree to go vegetarian together, you can see the measurable impacts that would have CO2 on deforestation and so on. 10 million or 100 million people say that, okay, like for the benefit of the future generations, we're going to step back from, things that are negatives, right now.
I think one thing that sticks out to me about that is it can't be something, a lot of these things aren't things that can be coerced by a top-down bureaucratic dictatorship structure. I think a lot of the things that you're talking about.
Oh, well, they totally could. I mean, in a way, China could become the first huge country to manifest total ecological direction. They could say like, okay, like all billion, plus people, and I don't know how many it is, 1.2 billion, you're all going to start doing permaculture. We're going to move people back to the countryside. We're going to do bioremediation. Everyone's going to learn how to, and in fact, in a way that almost seems more likely than that happening through, the sort of turbulent, hyper-individualized systems we have in the West. But it would be preferable. I mean, I think it would be more beautiful as an answer if it became something that was done through kind of, voluntary social contracts.
And I think that can be involved with governments. I mean, what we're seeing right now, for example, in Finland is they're just starting to institute a program of universal basic income where they're giving, I think, 2,000 people 600 euros a month. And they're testing that out. And of course, I think then, one of the arguments with universal basic income is when you provide that, then you enable people to step outside the dichotomy of, okay, I have to work and earn money in order to provide for myself. And they can start doing more creative art producing things, which I think often expresses a sense of authenticity in the individual, which creates, I think, a more beautiful environment. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about reminds me of like Charles Eisenstein and the work that he's done with like sacred economics.
I edited that book.
I've read. Oh, you did?
Yeah, I published it.
Oh, phenomenal. What'd you think of that book? I mean, how did you build on those ideas?
Well, I thought that his analysis was great, but I felt that his prescription for this alternative was very murky.
Okay.
But actually, I'm having a discussion with him in New York in a week. And I love Charles. Yeah, I'm curious also because he has a whole, he's negative around the whole framing of climate change. And I can understand that to a certain perspective. And I think, I look more at like what you call the planetary boundaries model of Stockholm resilience. But I'm trying to still grok. Sometimes I feel that I don't totally grok all of his way of looking at the situation. So I think we have some differences of opinion that'll be interesting to tease out.
And what do you think? I mean, what are some of those differences of opinion in terms of how you perceive things compared to him?
I feel that he gets a little bit tangled into, focusing on this idea of the story. And the story is important, but also I think we need to deal with the tangible evidence-based reality, right? Which is like, we're at 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we know the last time there was that much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, temperatures were 4 degrees Celsius warmer and sea levels were 100 feet higher. But to me, that's useful information rather than just saying, oh, that's, that's not an interesting frame. I don't quite understand. Sometimes I feel like, what does he want people to do?
Okay, so you don't understand the practicalities.
I guess not, yeah.
Okay. And I think that's something that I was struggling as well with after I read that book I think I read it in like mid-November of last year. So maybe...
Sacred Economics?
Yeah, 4 or 5 months ago. And I remember talking to a number of friends after it, and it was similar feedback that I was getting. Well, yeah, the system sounds great, but what are the practical steps that you can take to do it? I mean, he even talks about in the book about how he was trying to figure out ways to I think the example he spoke about is when you don't charge for something, it seems less enticing to buy into. So he was saying, for example, like if we set up retreats, I mean, this is just, it's not the example he used, but the one that I'm thinking of. If we set up retreats, for example, and we charge people only the cost, $900 of running the retreat, well, actually, we'll probably get less buy-in than if from a psychological perspective, we charged like $3,000, right? How do we overcome these human psychology things? And maybe we don't. Maybe we have to play into
money is a particular energy. It's really complicated. I mean, similarly, I've had enterprises that have been run with volunteer love. And then when money comes in and you start paying people, it actually becomes much worse. Like the people are then like thinking about, what am I worth in relationship to this project? And it destroys the whole just soulful connection that everybody had to the project to begin with.
So, we've been talking a lot about the work that you've done, the writing that you've done, your ideas based on this. What was your experience like, first coming to psychedelics? How did you even become interested in psychedelics? And why did you decide to do all this work in the first place?
Well, I guess, I went to a liberal college in Connecticut that had a psychedelic history, Wesleyan University. Actually, this guy, John Perry Barlow, I later became friends with, had been there in the 60s, and he later became a writer for the Grateful Dead. And it had a long tradition of psychedelic use. And so I tried psychedelics just a handful of times when I was like 19, I guess, 20, and found them really fascinating. Then I dropped out of college. I wasn't happy. I went into the work world. I was working in magazines, wanted to be a novelist, poet. I was editing a literary magazine. In my late 20s, I started to write freelance. I wrote a piece about ecological crisis issues around why the sperm count is declining. Discovered that it was due to the toxicity of the environment, the plastics and pesticides that were concentrating up the food chain. I became aware that we were facing this whole ecological disaster that was looming. And I tried to understand why nobody around me seemed to be able to care about it. And I realized that all of us were afflicted by this deep inner sort of cynicism or nihilism that had to do with our belief that consciousness was only brain-based, that therefore there could be no continuity of life after death. And I realized that I was afflicted by the same cynicism. Then I began to wonder, how did I actually know? What was the basis of my knowledge that there couldn't be any other dimensions of existence or soul or spiritual existence? And then I remembered my psychedelic experiences from college as suggesting that consciousness was a lot bigger and had a lot of other doorways into it. So then I happened to get, then I just decided I would focus on that area. I started to get assignments, took ayahuasca at a ceremony in downtown New York. And I just found it more and more fascinating. And I kept, then I got an assignment to go to West Africa and go through a Bwiti initiation in Gabon, taking Iboga. And I think at that point I realized that I ultimately would like to write a book about it. And then just like one doorway just kept opening into another.
And what are some of the other projects that then you've worked on? I know you wrote Breaking Open the Head, you wrote Quetzalcoatl, and now you have How Soon Is Now. What other psychedelic-related projects have you been involved in?
Well, I made a documentary, 2012 Time for Change, which in some ways it's still on YouTube, but it's in some ways a prelude to this book because it talks about the prophetic thought structure of the Maya, but it also talks about like permaculture and bioremediation and alternative economic systems. I started a company. We published the web magazine Reality Sandwich, which has done thousands of articles at this point related to shamanism and consciousness and psychedelics. And we also had we have a platform. I'm not really actively involved with the company, but it's still ongoing. Evolver.net. We have video teleseminars, Evolver Learning Labs that have done many video courses on psychedelic-related stuff. I've been in many other films and documentaries, like DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and I guess that kind of stuff.
Cool. And so, one thing I wanted to ask you about was, I read your book, Breaking Open the Head, where you described all these various experiences that you had. Yeah. I think the one that was most interesting to me was your experience with DPT. Can you just tell our audience a little bit about, what DPT is, and can you tell us about that experience that you had that you wrote about in Breaking Open the Head?
Sure. Dimethyltryptamine is a naturally occurring psychedelic. Dipropyltryptamine is a very close, kind of cousin to DMT. It's substituting a propyl for methyl group. But as far as we know, it doesn't occur in nature at all. I don't even know when it was discovered, actually. But like DMT, when you, I think it actually can be taken orally. It can be ingested as a powder or a pill because it doesn't. Our enzymes, the gut, don't recognize it and neutralize it. But it's also a very powerful psychedelic. But the experience that I had on it, and I've read some people have very ecstatic and joyful experiences on it, but I happened to do it in this period of my life where I was kind of undergoing this kind of self-administered course of psychedelic initiation that had included ayahuasca and Iboga in Gabon. And I took it sort of in an unprepared way with a friend of mine And we really had felt that we were kind of like suddenly beset upon by diabolic entities that we could see around us and so on. And one of them seemed to sort of stay with me. And, so I described it in the book. I had all these different kind of psychophysical kind of manifestations, things happening. And that was kind of the story.
What were some of those psychophysical things?
That's really not. It's in the book. I don't know if I really need to go deep into it, but for me, it was like it seemed to correlate with a lot of things you read about, and people like Aleister Crowley and Carlos Castaneda, and really, changed my sense of what is out there and these other realities. And ultimately, I got very connected to Rudolf Steiner's ideas. I felt that he provided the best kind of mapping or framing of this kind of other dimensional worlds of spirits that intersect with our reality in different ways.
Very cool. So what's next for you? You're still, I would assume, doing work for the book that you recently published, How Soon Is Now. Do you have any other projects that are on the horizons or any other things that you're working on that fit in line with a lot of the things that you talk about in How Soon Is Now?
Sure. I have a contract to write a book on ayahuasca next, so I'm going to plunge back into that and look at how ayahuasca has spread all over the world and how that's had some really positive but also some negative aspects to it. And I'm very interested, having created Reality Sandwich and Evolver, I'd like to be involved with building another media platform, maybe something a little bit more mainstream. I really, when I see what's happening in the US, I feel that the power of Fox News, CNN once seemed so conservative, but now you have Fox News, now you have Breitbart. It's really re-sculpted the subjectivities, consciousness, impacted the consciousness of a lot of people. And also the way they won this election is using these kind of tools like Facebook now is a gigantic opportunity for psychological profiling. So the company that the Trump people were using, Cambridge Analytica, has created psychological profiles of basically everybody in the US. And they can target, messages at them and see what they respond to and then keep feeding them more. And that's really how they rapidly shifted the discourse in a way that led to Trump winning the election. So I'd love to be involved with a counter media, large-scale, mainstream counter media project that would be solution-focused and positive, but also very authentic and presenting the reality of the challenges we're facing, from automation to ecological disasters and the loss of indigenous cultures and so on, but then really not just leaving people in the sense of fear or state or whatever, but actually providing them with actionable plans and solutions.
Fascinating. Well, let's, there are people starting to enter the cafe. We'll wrap up now. I'll kind of do first of all, you have a phenomenal mind, and I think it's super interesting to talk to you about these things, to read your books. I would highly recommend anyone listening to this to go and check those out. In this,
I also have a How Soon Is Now podcast on iTunes, which I'm doing every week or so.
You do? Okay. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to ask you. If people want to find out more information about you, if they want to follow you, if they want to, and we'll provide this in the show notes as well, so that people can see it. Where can they find you?
HowSoonIsNow.info, and there's one website for the book, and then Pinchbeck.io is a lot of my old writings and interviews and stuff like that.
Cool. So howsoonisnow.info, pinchbeck.io, and then there's also the podcast on iTunes.
How Soon Is Now.
And then, of course, your books, Breaking Open the Head.
2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, and How Soon Is Now.
Great. Yeah. Well, any final thoughts that you want to leave us with regarding, psychedelics or regarding the this ecological initiation or anything else that comes to mind?
Can't think of anything right now.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Daniel. So this week in psychedelics, let's get right to it. I don't want to waste any time. I want to get you guys the information that you need. So a quick overview, and then I'll go into detail about each one. The Sunshine Makers, which is a documentary about LSD manufacturing in the 60s and 70s, is now on Netflix. On April 11th, there's going to be an event in Los Angeles run by the AWARE Project called Psychedelic Prohibition and the Criminalization of Culture. And three major pieces of marijuana news. West Virginia medical marijuana was approved by the Senate. Private marijuana use was decriminalized in South Africa, and Californians have been protected against enforcement of federal marijuana laws. First thing is first, the Sunshine Makers. What is that? Well, let's go to its Rotten Tomatoes. So it was directed by Cosmo Fielding Mellon, whose mother is Amanda Fielding, who runs the Beckley Foundation. And basically, The Sunshine Makers is a real-life Breaking Bad for the psychedelic set. It reveals the fascinating, untold story of Nicholas Sand and Tim Scully, the unlikely duo at the heart of the 1960s American drug counterculture. United in a utopian mission to save the planet through the consciousness-raising power of LSD, these underground chemists manufactured a massive amount of acid, including the gold standard for quality LSD, quote-unquote, orange sunshine, all while staying one step ahead of the feds. From the producer of Searching for Sugar Man and Listen to Me Marlin, The Sunshine Makers premiered last year at the prestigious DOC NYC Film Festival to critical acclaim. The documentary has thrilled audiences with its stranger-than-fiction look into the lives of two LSD evangelists. What about psychedelic prohibition and culture? So what's this? Well, it is... I'll kind of give you the description of it. So psychedelic prohibition is a legacy of colonialism and the repression of indigenous cultures. Thousands of people are handcuffed, arrested, branded as criminals, and served time behind bars every year simply for using or possessing a psychedelic substance in the U.S. And these people are more likely to be young, non-white, and socioeconomically marginalized than most people who use psychedelics. While psychedelic-assisted therapy could be approved in the next decade, that would do nothing to change the criminal penalties for people who use psychedelics outside of government-sanctioned, medically supervised settings. We don't want to end up in a world where psychedelics are legal for a privileged few, while communities who have historically suffered the worst harms of prohibition remain criminalized. Join us as Morgan Humphrey and Amy Ewell of the Drug Policy Alliance discuss the history of the criminalization of psychedelic substances, the racist and cultural factors that influence its legality, and what we can do to end the criminalization of psychedelic substances. And that is hosted by the Aware Project, and it is going to be on our page. We'll link to it. Doors open at 7 for drinks and mingling, and the presentation will begin at 8 p.m. And again, that's on April 11. Other news, the Senate passes a medical marijuana bill in West Virginia. It would legalize medical marijuana in the state. Senate Bill 386, the West Virginia Medical Cannabis Act, it would create a state cannabis commission that would be responsible for developing policies and regulations to make medical cannabis available to qualifying patients. It would be effective by July 2018. South Africa High Court just legalized private cannabis use. The Western Cape High Court in South Africa ruled that keeping weed illegal is unconstitutional. The decision marks a significant change in South Africa's cannabis laws, effectively legalizing private cannabis use. I'm just looking if there's anything else that I should tell you about specific to this, and I think that's it. Phenomenal. Finally, California lawmakers introduced legislation to protect Californians against federal attacks on lawful marijuana activity. AB 1578 will protect Californians who are operating lawfully under our state laws by providing that, absent a court order, local and state agencies, including regulators and law enforcement, shall not assist in any federal enforcement against state-authorized medical cannabis or commercial or non-commercial marijuana activity. The bill will get its first hearing April 18 in the Assembly Public Safety Committee. So guys, that's it for this week in psychedelics. If you get a chance, just leave us a brief review, and we'll kind of close with our typical outro. So it was a pleasure to have all of you here again, and have a phenomenal rest of your Sunday and the rest of your week.
Thanks for listening to the Psychedelia Podcast with Paul Austin. Want more psychedelic information? Go to our website at thethirdwave.co and register for our email list and newsletter. Also, please consider donating to The Third Wave via our Patreon page. Donations make this podcast possible. Psychedelics have the potential to transform lives. By donating, you enable us to continue to inform people about the benefits of these powerful substances.